Welcome to our video on 2D arrays. I'm going to start with how to make a 2D array. So first we need to declare our variable. So I'm going to make this an array of booleans. So boolean is our data type for true and false. And then after I write our data type, I'm going to put two sets of brackets to indicate that this is a 2D array. Our next step is we need to name our array, just like we give any variable a name. So I'm going to call this my array. And now we've declared it. Our next step is to set the size. So we're going to say the name of our variable. And then we're setting it equal to a new array. So we're going to write this word new. And then we're going to say again that it's a Boolean array. And then we're going to use our two square brackets, but this time we are going to set the size. So how many rows and how many columns are in our 2D array. So I'm going to set it to have 4 rows and 10 columns. So now we have our array set up. So my array is going to have only Boolean values, so only true or false, and it's going to be a grid of 4 rows and 10 columns. Now the next thing we might want to do is print out individual elements from this. So to do that, we're going to use our println function. We need to tell it that we're printing a value from my array. And then we need to tell it which spot we want to print. So we're going to use two sets of square brackets to tell it the row and column for the value we want to print. So if we want to do the first row, we're going to put 0 in our first square bracket. So that's going to be our very top row. And then maybe we want our second column, so second from the left. So that's going to be column 1. So now if I run this, we should see it print out down here in the console. And indeed we do. It says false because by default all of our Boolean values in our array are going to be false until we change them to be true. Now in addition to printing elements, we might want to change their value. So maybe we want to set this element to be true instead of false. So what we can do is again tell it which array we're working with, and then the location that we want to change. Our equal sign because we're giving it a value, and now I want it to be true. So now we can print that out again. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it down below where we changed the value. So when we run through this code from top to bottom, at this point our value should still be false. So this will print false. Then we change it to true. And then when we print it again, it should show true. So we're going to try that out. And we do get false and then true. So this line of code worked and we changed the value in our 2D array. Now, another thing we might want to do with an element is check what its value is. So we can use an if statement for that. So we're going to say if the value at row 0, column 1 is true, then we're going to print something out. Here we're going to use two equal signs because we're asking if this is equal. We are not setting it equal. So we're asking, is it true? If it's false, we're not going to be changing it to true. So that's why we have the two equal signs. So if it is, then we're going to add another print statement here. And we'll just print out the words, it's true. So since we happen to know that it is true, this if statement should be true, and we should print out these words. So let's see if that happens. And it worked. Our if statement was true, so we printed out these words. Now, sometimes we want to look at all the elements in our array, not just one individual element. And to do that, we need to use loops. So we're going to be repeating a process for every single element in our array. So we're going to start by printing out all of the elements in our 2D array. So we're going to need to set up for loops for that. I'm going to make a variable called row because this loop is going to be looping through each row in our 2D array. We're going to start at row 0 and continue looping as long as row is less than the number of rows in our 2D array. So you'll remember up here we said there's going to be 4 rows in our 2D array. So I could type the number 4 here. If I didn't know that it was 4 rows, I could also use the length. So myArray.length tells me how many rows are in the array. And this plus plus here is a shorthand for row equals row plus 1. So it's the same thing as this. All right, so we have a loop that's going to loop through each row. And now we need a loop that's going to loop across each row, so going through each column. So I'm going to nest my next for loop inside of it. And now I'm going to make a variable for the column. Again, starting at 0, so we'll start on the left-hand side of each row and move across it. And if we look back up here, we have 10 columns. So I can put the number 10 here. Or another way to indicate how many columns are in your array is myArray, and then we have to tell it which row. So I'm going to use our row variable from up here. This gives me 1 row in my array, and then I ask for the length of that row. All right, so now inside of here, I can print out each element in the array. I'm going to use print instead of println so that they all end up going in one line across here. And then when we get to the end of the row, we'll move down and print the next row down below. So to print out each element, I'm going to tell it get an element from my array at position row call. So this loop is going to repeat over and over once for each column in the first row. And then when we're done, we want to move down to the next line so that when this loop starts repeating, we go to the next row, printing out all those elements, we want them to be on the next line in our terminal. So to do that, down here after this for loop ends, I'm going to put println, and then I'll just move us to the next line. So now if we run this, we should end up with all of our values printed out in a nice grid. And you can see that we do down here. So we have all these values printed out, and you can even see that in our top row, second from the left, we have that value that's true, and that's because we changed it up here in our code on this line. All the other values are false because that's our default for Booleans. Now the last thing I'm going to show you is how to use our nested loops to count up how many elements match a certain criteria. So for example, I want to count up how many elements are true in my 2D array. So to do that, I'm still going to need these nested loops, but I'm not going to be printing anymore, so I'm going to take out these prints. Instead, what I'm going to do is make a variable for counting. We started at 0, and then as we go through all of the elements in our 2D array, if any of them are true, we're going to add 1 to count so that we count up how many are true. So we're going to need an if statement in here. And we're going to have an if statement that looks really similar to this one up here, but instead of always checking the element at row 0, column 1, we're going to check the element using row and column variables. So now when row and column are both 0 at the beginning, we're checking our first element. Then column is going to become 1, so we'll check row 0, column 1, and so on until we've gone through all of our elements checking them. If this if statement is true for any of them, we're going to add 1 to count. And then at the very end, to see how many are true, we're going to print out our count variable. So since we only changed 1 to true, this should be printing out 1 at the end. And we'll check that. And it does. It prints out 1 because this if statement was only true for one of our elements. So we only added 1 to count.